Do you know what it's like to be treated like a nuisance on the day you should be celebrating? I thought this would never happen to me. On Mother's Day, as I balanced the dessert dish in my hands, trying not to spill anything, I heard a low sound, like a whisper, but it pierced my soul. It was my daughter's voice, on the family group. Grandma Edna is a nightmare. She always ruins the mood. I felt my legs tremble, but I remained standing. No one noticed, or maybe they did and pretended not to see. It was as if, suddenly, all the noise in the room had faded. I looked around and saw laughter, silverware clanging against plates, children running, and inside me, only a heavy silence. The kind of silence that comes not from outside, but from within, when you realize you're no longer welcome. It's strange how loneliness can scream, even when the house is full. Have you ever felt that? My life has always been dedicated to that table. I bought every plate, every tablecloth myself. I remember working all night sewing to pay for my daughter Rachel's schooling. I deprived myself of new clothes to buy Christmas presents for others. And now, on the day mothers should be celebrated, I was the hidden joke, the burden everyone bears out of politeness. I continued serving dessert, as if nothing had happened. With each slice I placed on someone's plate, it felt like I was also serving a piece of my dignity. And no one noticed. Or maybe they did, and it didn't matter. There's a different kind of pain when the contempt comes from the one you raised, the one you believed would always be there for you. As I passed the table, eyes averted, no one really looked at me. It was as if I'd become invisible. I remembered so many stories I'd heard of other women like me, mothers, grandmothers who gave their all and, in the end, were forgotten. Humiliation on Mother's Day isn't just about not getting flowers, it's about being physically present and emotionally absent to those who matter most. I sat alone in the corner, observing. I thought about the cold messages in the family group, the increasingly rare calls, the visits that never happened. The rejection didn't come suddenly, I realized. It accumulated slowly, like dust we only notice when the sun shines through the window. But in that moment, I saw it all clearly. I could have cried right then and there, but I didn't. I held my ground. What they didn't know was that while I was smiling on the outside, something inside was changing. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I felt like that would be the last Mother's Day I'd spend like that. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt that your presence bothers more than it brings joy? It's a wound you can't see, but it weighs on your entire body. And in that moment, between the distant sound of laughter and the bitter taste of what should have been sweet, I began to understand that, to regain my peace, I couldn't wait for them to invite me into it. I remember when life seemed simpler. I was always the first to wake up, before the sun even touched the window, and the last to go to bed, when the whole house was already plunged into silence. There was a certain comfort in this cycle, as if my routine were a silent proof of love. I arose with a tired body, but with a soul convinced that I was building something greater than myself. I crocheted until my fingers were stiff, washed strangers' clothes to pay every tuition for Rachel's school. There were no luxuries, but there was purpose. I remember the smell of soap on my hands, the sound of coins dropping into the jar where I kept my money for notebooks and uniforms. Every small sacrifice was a brick in the bridge I imagined I was building between us. She was my reason for living. Everything revolved around seeing her well-fed, well-dressed, well-prepared to face the world. I told myself that one day, she would understand. One day, she would see that behind every worn-out outfit, there was a new gift for her, that behind every sleepless night, there was the guarantee that she would have what I never had. But life has a curious way of testing our certainties. What we do in silence, believing it will be recognized in the future, sometimes gets lost in the noise of haste, ego, and ingratitude. I watched her childhood pass in the kitchen, among pots and pans and laundry baskets. I was always there, but always standing, always serving, always caring. I never learned to sit down and be cared for, and perhaps, without realizing it, I taught her that I didn't need that care. There were nights when I'd lie on the edge of my bed staring at the ceiling, imagining what the future would hold. In my mind, I saw frequent visits, loving phone calls, grandchildren running around the house. I saw myself surrounded by familiar voices, feeling that all the effort had been worth it. But the hidden truth is that the love we give doesn't always return in the same measure. And when it doesn't, the absence weighs more heavily than any physical exhaustion. Even so, it never occurred to me that she might see me as a burden. I've always considered myself part of the foundation, the root that holds the tree together. And roots, even hidden ones, are essential. But the day I heard those words, I realized that perhaps she had never seen my roots, only the branches that, in her view, no longer bore fruit. I remember a specific day. Many years ago, it was winter, and the cold bit my skin. I had sold a shawl I was making to buy her the gift she wanted for Christmas. I remember her opening the package and smiling. That smile was enough to warm me all night. Moments like that were the fuel that kept me going. It's funny to think how these memories infiltrate our minds in moments of pain, as if to remind us that history wasn't made only of sorrow. But at the same time, the contrast between what was and what is now becomes almost unbearable. People often think of sacrifice as something grand and visible, but true sacrifice is what no one sees. It's saying everything's fine when it's not. It's eating what's left so someone else has a full plate. It's wearing a worn-out coat so someone else has a new one. And perhaps the hardest thing to accept is realizing that, even after years of this kind of sacrifice, it's still possible to be left aside. I wonder when the bridge I was building began to crack. Maybe it was the first few times she canceled a visit at the last minute, or the short, hurried phone calls that felt more like an obligation than a genuine desire. Or maybe it was something more subtle, almost invisible, that built up without me noticing. These memories, mixed with the present, formed a strange mosaic in my mind. I was there, that Mother's Day, hearing my heart pound with humiliation. But I was also there in dozens of other moments, washing clothes in the sink, sewing at night, smiling at a future that, I now saw, never existed the way I'd imagined. While I tried to understand how everything had gotten to that point, a new perception began to dawn on me, something that I still couldn't name, but that was already changing the way I saw my own story. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I thought it was just me, that maybe I was more sensitive because of my age, or because I was more tired. But little by little, I realized that the warmth that had existed before was no longer there. The hugs became shorter, almost mechanical, as if they were social protocol rather than a sincere gesture. The messages in the family group, which had previously been full of laughter, photos, and stories, became short, emotionless, almost like calendar notices. It was as if I were being pushed, not out of the house, but out of their hearts. Last Christmas, something changed for me forever. The house was packed. The smell of good food filled the air, voices talking at once. I set the table as I always did, making sure everything was in its place. But when everyone sat down, I realized my place wasn't in the center, close to the conversation, but at the end, next to the dog. I smiled, as always, trying to appear unconcerned. The hidden truth is that, deep down, it pierced me. Not because of the physical discomfort, but because of the symbolic weight. The end of the table, for me, was never about space, it was about separation. These subtle signs of rejection don't come with clear announcements. They arrive silently, disguised as carelessness, but they carry an impact that only those who feel them can explain. It's as if someone is slowly erasing your presence, until one day you realize you've become a supporting character in your own story. And the curious thing is that this doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow journey, shaping your mindset, shaking your confidence, and eroding the image you had of yourself. There were times when I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe they're just busy, I told myself. But deep down, I knew something was different. Eyes don't lie. Words may be polite, but the look reveals everything. And in the looks they gave me, there was a mixture of impatience and indifference that hadn't existed before. I started paying attention to the behind-the-scenes details of these interactions. The pauses before responding to my messages, the way certain group conversations seemed to change subject as soon as I joined in, the tone of voice that sounded more tolerant than affectionate. These are things that may seem small to outsiders, but together, they tell a whole story. The impact of this isn't just emotional, it changes the way you position yourself in the world. I started speaking less, offering fewer opinions, as if I were occupying a space that no longer belonged to me. I realized I was shrinking my presence to fit into an increasingly smaller space within that dynamic. This wasn't a conscious decision. It was an instinctive adaptation, almost like when you recoil to avoid being hit. And yet, there was a part of me that didn't fully accept this transformation. A small but persistent voice that told me I had value, that my story mattered, that my place wasn't up for negotiation. This voice reminded me that I had weathered greater storms before, that my life was made of so much more than these cold, calculated interactions. But the contrast between that voice and the reality I lived was painful. It was like walking between two worlds, the world before, where I was part of the center, and the world now, where I was on the margins. It wasn't just about a place at the table, or how many words we exchanged within the family group. It was about the position I occupied in their affections. And little by little, I began to understand that these subtle signs weren't just oversights, they were decisions, silent, perhaps even unconscious, decisions that revealed a lot about how I was now seen. And this realization, as bitter as it was, began to prepare me for something that, at that moment, I didn't yet know was coming, but that would forever change the way I saw things. A week before Mother's Day, when my heart had already settled into its slow, indifferent rhythm, the phone rang. It was Rachel. Her voice sounded softer than usual, and that alone made me feel strange. "Mommy, let's do something special for you," she said. For a moment, I felt a familiar warmth course through my chest. It was as if someone had turned on a light in a dark room. I couldn't hold back the tears. After so long feeling left out, it was as if that call were an invitation to belong again. I spent the rest of the day with my head full of ideas. I thought about what to bring, what to wear. I finally decided it was time to buy a new dress, something that would make me feel alive, that would bring back a bit of the woman I was before I became just grandma. As I tried on clothes in the store, I found myself smiling to myself, imagining the moment I'd arrive and be welcomed with open arms. That small spark of anticipation began to shift my mindset. It was as if I were preparing for a transformation, for a silent reconciliation. Maybe they had finally realized how I'd been feeling. Maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter, where the wounds would begin to heal. I wanted to believe this, with all my might. I spent the entire week busying myself with details. I chose a delicate scarf to match my dress. I washed my favorite shoes and put on new perfume. I even baked one of my cakes again, the same one that was always a hit at family gatherings. It was more than just a sweet treat. It was a gesture of love, a symbol of presence. I wanted to arrive not only looking put together on the outside, but also feeling renewed in my soul. As I prepared everything, I realized how quickly the human heart creates narratives of hope. All it takes is a phrase, a gesture, and we begin to write an entire story in our heads. This is the hidden truth no one likes to admit. It doesn't take much to make us believe things can change, and when you've endured a journey of rejection and silence, any sign of attention feels like a call back home. However, part of me still carried a silent fear. I was well acquainted with life's twists and turns, and I knew that not every invitation is what it seems, but I consciously decided to set my fear aside. Sometimes we choose to believe the prettiest version of the story, not because it's the most likely, but because it's the one that keeps us going. The night before, I barely slept. I kept imagining every detail, the hugs, the conversations, the sounds of children running around. I felt like I was about to find something I'd lost years ago. It was like returning backstage to a show I'd once starred in, but which I was now watching from the audience. On Mother's Day morning, I woke up early. I got ready calmly, as if preparing for a moment that would define more than just that day. The new dress fit well, and the scarf around my neck reminded me that, despite everything, I still knew how to take care of myself. I looked in the mirror, and almost didn't recognize my reflection, not because I looked different on the outside, but because there was something in my eyes I hadn't seen in a long time, a mixture of anticipation and faith. I left the house, carefully carrying the cake. The sun was high, and the wind seemed lighter. On the way, I found myself remembering other times, when we were a close-knit family, when I was an essential part of every celebration. It was impossible not to feel that that day held symbolic weight. When I arrived, the door was ajar. Voices were coming from inside, cheerful and carefree. I took a deep breath before entering, feeling I was about to experience something that would remain etched in my memory, for better or worse. As I walked through the door, I held the cake in both hands as if it were a sacred gift, something that held more than sugar and flour. It held memories, imagined reconciliations, a silent attempt to mend what had been torn. The smell of warm food filled the room, and for a brief moment I felt that perhaps all of this was real, that the invitation had been sincere, that the entire week of anticipation had not been a mistake. I smiled at a few who glanced at me briefly, but I noticed their eyes quickly returned to their conversations with one another. I placed the cake in the kitchen and began helping. As I always did, it was my natural reflex, washing hands, organizing dishes, serving drinks. I believed that by participating, I would be reintegrating into the circle I felt I'd lost. It was then, as I was gathering cutlery, that I heard a muffled sound, the message tone on the cell phone on the table. It wasn't mine, but it was close enough that the lit screen caught my attention. I didn't look for it, but I also didn't look away quickly enough. And there it was. A short sentence, almost innocent to those unfamiliar with the weight of certain words. She kills the mood. For a second, I thought I'd read it wrong. I read it again. It was about me. There was no doubt. My body reacted before my mind. I felt my stomach sink, my hands grow cold. In the background, muffled laughter came from the room, as if the sound were passing through a glass wall. The mix of voices and silverware clanging against plates became distant, almost as if I were watching everything from outside, from a place where no one could see me. I smiled. I smiled like someone who saw nothing, like someone who felt nothing. The kind of smile that's more of a mask than an expression. I put the cutlery on the table and continued helping, while inside, my heart was falling. It's strange how, in moments like these, we try to cling to any explanation that will soften the blow. Maybe it was a joke, maybe it wasn't serious, but deep down, the hidden truth was already there. It wasn't a joke. It was a real thought, spoken with the confidence that I wouldn't see it. I remembered all the little things from the past few years, the hugs that had diminished, the colder conversations, the seat at the head of the table last Christmas. Everything fell into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd avoided putting together. And now, with that sentence, the picture was complete. I continued moving around the kitchen, but inside I was somewhere else, revisiting the journey that brought me there. I remembered the nights I'd stayed up waiting for her to get home from school. The times I'd kept my worries to myself so as not to overwhelm her. The countless moments I'd chosen silence to keep the peace. And there I was, being accused of killing the mood precisely because I'd never been the cause of a conflict. This is the part no one sees. The silent transformation that happens when you realize you're being excluded not by a single act, but by a sequence of small decisions made behind the scenes. Decisions that gradually diminish your space, your value, your voice. It's as if, little by little, the colors of your presence are erased, until only a dull outline remains. I took a deep breath, not to hold back the tears, but to keep my body steady. I knew that if I showed pain at that moment, they'd have the perfect excuse to say I don't know how to joke, that I take everything too seriously. So I put on my most neutral expression, and continued with what I was doing, while inside. A part of me said goodbye to something that perhaps had never existed the way I believed yet. Even amidst this pain, a different seed began to germinate. It wasn't pure anger, nor a desire for immediate revenge. It was something deeper, the realization that perhaps I no longer needed to fight for a place in a space that clearly no longer wanted to welcome me. This revelation came not as a scream, but as a persistent whisper, questioning whether my peace might lie precisely outside of this place. As I stirred the cups on the counter, my hands moved automatically, but my mind wandered to new paths, places I hadn't allowed myself to explore before. The idea that perhaps it was possible to build another life, with other presences, other conversations, began to take shape. It was still a timid idea, almost a forbidden thought, but it was there, breathing deeply within me, and it was in that state, between the still burning pain and the possibility of a new mindset, that I realized that moment would not be forgotten. Not because it hurt, but because it was opening space for something I couldn't yet name, but which, somehow, was already beginning to change the course of my story. After placing the cups on the counter, I looked around the room and saw the faces that for years had been the center of my life. I saw smiles that had once been for me, but now seemed to open only to others. I felt a lump in my throat and realized that if I stayed there for a few more minutes, I wouldn't be able to hold back the tears. I didn't want them to see. I didn't want to offer the silent satisfaction of watching myself break down. So, without making a sound, I grabbed my coat, placed the cake I'd brought on the corner of the table, and walked out the door as if just going for some air. The wind from the street hit me like a shock. The cold air brought back a piece of my lucidity, as if to say, you're still here. You can still decide where to go. I walked unhurriedly, letting my steps guide me away from that scene. Each step seemed to carry a silent decision, an internal rupture, a point of no return. I didn't have a defined destination, but I knew I didn't want to go home yet. I eventually arrived at the square. It was a simple space, with ancient trees and benches worn by time. A few people were gathered, their voices mingling in harmony. It was only then that I realized it was a community choir. I can't explain why, but I stopped to listen. Voices intertwined in a way that seemed to heat the very air. It wasn't perfect, some notes were lost, others stretched too far, but there was an honesty in the music I hadn't felt in a long time. A lady noticed me standing a little way off and waved me over. I hesitated. After all, I wasn't part of that group, but something about the way she smiled made me take a few steps forward. Soon others looked at me too, and I realized that none of them were interested in who I was or what emotional baggage I brought. They just wanted me to feel like I belonged. I remained silent, listening, and for the first time in a long time, no one asked me to speak less, change the subject, or try not to spoil the mood. Instead, it seemed like every look I received said, "You can stay." After the song, some people sat on the benches. A younger woman offered me a bottle of water, and a gentleman commented on the atmosphere, as if we were reconnecting with an old conversation. I didn't know these people, but there was a naturalness in the way they included me that I no longer remember. I quickly explained that I was just passing by and heard someone say, "So you've arrived at the right time." They laughed, and this time I laughed along, not because I needed to hide it, but because I genuinely wanted to. That's when I realized something that deeply moved me. Human warmth can come from where we least expect it. Sometimes it doesn't come from blood, or even from family names. It comes from people who have no obligation to love us, and yet they choose to do so anyway. When the rehearsal ended, they began packing up the sheet music and makeshift benches. A gray-haired woman with a colorful scarf approached and asked, "Do you like to sing?" My first reaction was to say no, that I didn't know, that it had been a long time. But before I could come up with an excuse, she added, "It doesn't matter. Here, we sing because we want to be together." I felt a warmth rise in my chest. It was so simple, yet so rare. I agreed to stay for the next song, even though I wasn't sure if my voice would keep up with theirs. At first, my voice was low and uncertain, but I soon realized no one was there to judge. Each note I released seemed to carry a bit of the pain I'd brought with me, and somehow, by the end of the song, I felt lighter. They came closer, patted me on the shoulders, squeezed my hands, and the moment a tight hug enveloped me, I realized it was the first genuine hug I'd received in months. It wasn't pity, it wasn't obligation, it was simply affection, pure and silent. As the day drew to a close and the sky turned orange, I stood there a little longer, watching people pack their things, chat about their week, and plan their next get-together. I thought about how I'd left home for a family reunion and ended up finding a different kind of family, not one that shares blood, but one that shares presence, time, and care. And in that moment, as I prepared to return home, I took with me a strange and new certainty, like a secret I myself was still learning to understand. At first, my voice was almost silent. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, as if each note were a risk, a test I wasn't sure I'd pass. The lyrics felt more like a narrow path I had to tread carefully, so as not to stumble over the words. I sang softly, almost asking permission to exist in that collective sound. But something changed mid-song. Maybe it was the way the others looked at me, not with judgment, but with silent encouragement. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, no one expected me to be perfect. They were just happy I was there, and then my voice grew. Not because it got technically better, but because I let it carry everything that was bottled up inside me. Each syllable seemed to release a piece of the weight I'd been carrying on my shoulders. When the song ended, I was silent for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what had just happened. That's when a young woman, whom I'd never seen before, approached and said with a genuine smile, "You have a warming light." Those words fell over me like a warm blanket on a cold day. It wasn't about tuning, about the right tone. It was about something that came from within, that didn't depend on family approval or belated recognition. It was about presence, about the silent impact we can have on others, even without realizing it. There, among people who just a few hours earlier, were complete strangers. I felt seen, not in the way you see someone out of obligation, but in a genuine way that recognizes who you are, not just what you do. And the irony is that, for my own family, I was the nightmare that ruined the mood. For those people, I was comforted. Contrast struck me as a revelation. I realized I'd spent years trying to prove my worth in the wrong place, to people who might never have been willing to see it, and that, while I persisted in this silent struggle, the world out there remained full of people capable of offering what I sought. Reciprocity. The feeling of singing with them wasn't just liberating, it was transformative. It was as if I were repositioning myself in my own story, shifting the narrative's focus. I was no longer the woman waiting for an invitation to be accepted. I was the woman who allowed herself to enter a new place and leave her mark, even if it was just a few musical notes. I stood there, chatting with some of the choir members, listening to stories ranging from painful losses to small but significant achievements. Everyone seemed to understand the weight of arriving somewhere and being truly welcomed. It was as if there was a silent code between us, recognizing in each other the same need to belong that we carry within. As the sun began to set, I realized something inside me had shifted. It wasn't just about the singing or that hug at the end. It was about understanding that I had a choice, that despite all the rejection and the open wounds, I could still decide where to put my energy, my time, and my affection. That decision, that shift in mindset began there, on the park bench, surrounded by voices that included me without asking for anything in return. I didn't need to announce anything to anyone. There was no speech, no catchphrase, but inside me, a chapter had closed and another was beginning to be written, even if I didn't yet know all the details. And as I walked home that night, with the echo of voices still vibrating in the air, I began to realize that my story was about to take a path I never could have imagined. A few days after that unexpected encounter in the square, I still carried within me the likeness the choir had given me. It was as if every smile I received there had stayed with me, shielding me from any bitter memories. My routine returned, but in a different way. I no longer woke up feeling empty, as if the day were just another meaningless repetition. Now, there was a quiet flame within me, something that reminded me that the world is not just the walls of a house or the boundaries of a surname. It was a quiet afternoon, while I was watering the plants on the porch, that the phone rang. Rachel's number appeared on the screen. For a few seconds I considered not answering, not because I wanted to cut ties, but because I was still learning to deal with the weight that came with each conversation. I took a deep breath and answered. Her voice sounded different, filled with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard in years. "Mommy, you're famous," she said right away. I frowned, not understanding. She continued, "Emily saw a video of you singing with a group in the square. She showed it to me. It's everywhere, even on her friends' Facebook pages. People are commenting that your voice is moving, that you have a special glow." I felt my heart beat faster, but not out of pride. It was because of the irony of the situation. I, who until a few days ago had been the burden that ruined the mood, was now being praised by complete strangers who had never seen me before. And the strangest thing was that I had done nothing but be myself. I hadn't tried to impress. I hadn't rehearsed to please anyone. I simply sang because I felt welcomed. I waited a moment before responding. "The lady who ruins the mood has found someone who likes her warmth," she said in a calm but firm tone. It wasn't said with anger, nor with revenge. It was simply the acknowledgement of a truth that I could finally see clearly. On the other end of the line, there was a brief silence. Perhaps she was processing the words. Perhaps she was reflecting on what she'd really meant when she'd invited me to Mother's Day. The conversation continued superficially after that, but I knew something had been planted there. I don't know if it was regret, if it was just surprise, or if Rachel was beginning to realize that life has its own ways of returning what we give. The hidden truth of the so-called law of return is that it rarely comes in the form we imagine. It doesn't knock on the door announcing its arrival. It simply manifests itself, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, but always at just the right moment. And in that moment, I realized that the recognition I'd waited years for would never come the way I'd imagined, and that, perhaps, I didn't even need it. The validation that came from those people in the square, from the spontaneous comments on the video, had a different impact. It wasn't a favor. It wasn't pity. It was genuine. I spent the night thinking about this, about how life's twists and turns can completely transform the meaning of things. For so long, I believed my worth depended on a specific look, on words coming from certain mouths. Now, I saw that it was within me all along. The journey to understanding this was long, full of small signs that, at the time, I ignored. But in that moment, everything seemed to align. There was still hurt, of course. Years of silence and exclusion can't be erased with a few belated compliments. But there was also a new feeling, a kind of inner freedom. I no longer had to shrink to fit their vision of me. I no longer had to fight to be included in a space they had already decided I didn't belong. As these reflections settled within me, I thought about how that video had crossed paths I never would have reached on my own. People I'd never met were talking about my voice, about how it conveyed something moving. And I, who had for so long felt invisible, was now being seen in a way that didn't require effort or sacrifice. I lay down that night without the weight of someone waiting for recognition. I knew there was still much to understand, that this chapter wasn't closed. But for the first time in a long time, I felt that my story was no longer being written solely by the hands of others, and this silent and profound realization began to make room for something even greater that I couldn't yet define. Every Sunday, I walked to the same square where, months ago, I met a group of strangers who welcomed me as if they'd known me forever. The choir starts early, but I usually arrive before. I enjoy watching the city wake up, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the smell of coffee wafting from the surrounding bakeries. It's as if every detail is part of a new ritual, a constant reminder that I'm no longer trapped in that version of myself that was content to wait for others. Now, when I open my mouth to sing, there's no hesitation. My voice isn't perfect, but it's whole. It carries stories, memories, pains, and joys that don't need to be hidden. Everyone there calls me grandmother's voice. At first, I thought it was just an affectionate joke, but I realized there was something deeper in that nickname. It's not about age, it's about what my voice conveys, that kind of warmth that only those who have truly felt cold can offer. I've made new friends, people of different ages, with completely different lives, but who share something essential: the ability to be present. When I'm with them, I don't feel like I need to prove myself, nor do I need to measure my words to avoid uncomfortable looks. I can be spontaneous, I can laugh out loud, I can even be silent without it being interpreted as cold. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a journey of small decisions, all born from a single shift in mindset, that I no longer need to seek approval from places that have already closed their doors to me. I can create my own spaces, my own connections. The hidden truth I learned is that, often, the family that nourishes us most isn't the one we're born with, but the one that chooses to walk alongside us. I still hold memories of my past life. They haven't disappeared, but they no longer carry the same weight. Before, they were open wounds. Now, they are scars that tell a story. They remind me of where I came from, but they don't define where I'm going. And it's in this balance between memory and renewal that I find the strength to carry on. In the choir, I'm not a burden, I'm a presence. My friends say my voice gives them confidence during the most difficult parts of the songs, that my singing style helps others loosen up. It's curious how, in an environment of true acceptance, even things that once seemed insignificant gain value. And somehow, this feeling spills over into other areas of my life. I started participating in community events, fairs, and cultural gatherings. I discovered talents I hadn't even realized I had, like painting small pictures and writing short stories. People I met at these places invited me for coffee, walks in the park, and theater performances. My schedule, which once felt like a blank calendar, now fills with commitments I truly want to fulfill. This emotional rebirth also brought a new perspective on myself. I started taking care of myself not out of vanity or obligation, but out of pleasure. I went back to wearing clothes that reflect my personality, experimenting with different hairstyles, and choosing perfumes that make me smile. It's as if every detail is a way of affirming, I am here, I exist, and my presence matters. Even so, there are still days when loneliness tries to knock on the door. But now, I know how to acknowledge it without letting it in. I know I have somewhere to go. I know there are people who are happy to see me arrive. And this certainty is a powerful antidote to any shadows of the past. Looking back, I realize that the impact of that phrase, "she kills the mood," wasn't just destructive, it was also a turning point, a trigger that pushed me out of a life that, deep down, no longer belonged to me. Today, I see that without that painful moment, I might never have found this new home, these new voices, this new version of myself. And, as I prepare for another Sunday of music and smiles, I feel like there's still a lot to come. Something inside me tells me this story is far from over. Today, I understand that the word family carries meanings that go far beyond what's written in documents or engraved in DNA. It's built day by day, in small actions, in the hands that reach out without you having to ask, in the looks that say you matter, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. For years, I believed that being related by blood to someone was enough to guarantee affection, respect, and care. But life has shown me, harshly and clearly, that biological ties are not synonymous with emotional ties. What I found after that afternoon of rejection wasn't just a group of people singing in the square. It was a safe space where my presence was celebrated, not tolerated, where my voice didn't need to compete for attention, and where I didn't need to hide parts of myself to fit narrow expectations. It's curious how often we need to be pushed out of a place that no longer serves us to discover that there's a whole world waiting for you. A world that's ready to receive the very thing we've spent years trying to hide. The hidden truth is that when you stop insisting on fitting in where you're not wanted, you discover that there are people who not only make room for you, but also rejoice in your arrival. This changes everything. The way you walk down the street, the way you look in the mirror, the way you position yourself in the world. It's a silent but profound transformation that redefines your sense of belonging. Today, my life is filled with voices that don't share my last name, but who share my desire to be with them. They've become my network, my safe haven. I've learned that true presence isn't about obligation, but about choice. And when someone chooses to be by your side, even without formal ties, that presence is worth more than any title. I know many people who will hear this story are experiencing something similar. Maybe you feel invisible in your own home, as if your existence is a burden to those who should be lifting you up. Maybe you've grown accustomed to cold hugs, empty messages, and invitations that seem more like protocol than a desire. I know how this corrodes you. I know what it's like to hear a phrase that reduces you to a nuisance, and then have to smile to avoid ruining the mood even further. But what I want you to take away from everything I've experienced is that there isn't just one door to affection. If one closes, it doesn't mean the whole world has closed. There are other doors, windows, even wide open gates, waiting for you to muster the courage to walk through. And on the other side, there may be exactly what you've always sought: genuine acceptance, human warmth, true belonging. The impact of this discovery is so profound that it changes not only the present, but also the way you see the future. It stops being a journey of survival and becomes a journey of construction. You stop living at the mercy of the decisions of those who don't value you and start writing your own narrative. This doesn't mean erasing the past, but rather taking away its power to dictate the rest of your life. Family isn't just about those born together. Family is about those who don't leave you alone, those who celebrate your victories as if they were their own, who hold your hand on difficult days without asking for an explanation, who are happy just because you're there. And if today you feel like you're faded, know this: there's a world waiting for the brilliance you've hidden out of shame or fear of not being accepted. This world may be closer than you think sometimes, just a few steps away, in a square, in a group, in an unexpected place. And if you've ever been called a nuisance by those who should love you, know that you're not alone. There's a silent legion of people who've felt the same way, and who, like me, discovered that belonging is a mutual choice, not an imposition. So, if this story spoke to you, if any part of it resonated within you, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," because, in the end, that's what keeps us going, knowing that, even after all the rejection, there are still those who stay. If you've stuck with me this far, it's because, somehow, this story found a place within you. So, since we've built this conversation together, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next chapters, which may also bring you new reflections and strengths for your own journey. And I want to know who actually walked to the end with me. Leave a comment. I'm with you until the end. It will be our way of recognizing those who were present in every detail of this story. If this video touched you, please leave a like. It's not just the button, It's a sign that this connection resonated, and that it's worth continuing to share this type of content here. And since we've come this far together, there's a video here that complements this conversation in a special way. Click and continue with me there. Our exchange doesn't have to stop now.